So anybody come in? Could you please turn off your cameras and keep your mics mute, please? Well, welcome everybody to the second in the Cutting Edge series in Development Thinking and Practice. I have great pleasure tonight to welcome our two speakers, Ha-Joon Chang and Francisco Ferreira, and I'll come back to introduce them properly in a moment. Can I remind everyone to mute mics and turn off your cameras until later? The whole event is being recorded, now including the question and answer session, and it'll be available also as a podcast afterwards. The event is being live streamed to YouTube. Students in Zoom can write their questions into the chat and we will call on you to speak. Those who want to remain anonymous can private message Greta Zibo in the chat. Those watching on YouTube can text us your questions through the YouTube chat. And I remind everybody that the hashtag Cutting Edge is the Twitter response to this lecture. So, welcome Ha-Joon Chang back to the LSE. We always like to have you. Ha-Joon is professor in the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge, where he teaches development economics. In addition to numerous journal articles and book chapters, he's published 16 books. The main ones are The Political Economy of Industrial Policy, Kicking Away the Ladder, Bad Samaritans, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, and Economics, the User's Guide. His writings have been translated and published in 42 languages in 44 countries. I still remember back in 2005, on my first trip to Kigali in Rwanda, I went into a little grocery store and they had just a small rack of books, and on it, I saw his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, and promptly took a photograph to send it back to him to say he was having some impact in far-flung places. Worldwide, his books have sold over 2 million copies. He's the winner of the 2003 Gunnar Myrdal Prize and the 2005 Vasily Leontiev Prize. Ha-Joon is a huge contributor to thinking and theorizing about development, but he's also probably one of the most prominent public figures educating the wider public about development. So it's a pleasure, Ha-Joon, to have you come to speak to us about The Political Economy of Parasite, the movie. And we're equally lucky to have our own Francisco Ferreira here as a discussant. Francisco is the Amartya Sen Professor of Inequality Studies and Director of the International Inequalities Institute here at the LSE. I told him I think he has his work cut out for him as inequality seems to grow and grow. Francisco works on the measurement, causes, and consequences of inequality and poverty, with an emphasis on developing countries in general and Latin America in particular. His research has been published widely and awarded a number of prizes. He's also a research fellow at ISA in Bonn and an affiliated scholar with the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York. He currently serves as Vice President of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association. He was born and raised in Sao Paulo, great place in Brazil, and holds a PhD in economics from the LSE. So welcome, Francisco. We're really delighted you could join us. So now, without further ado, Ha-Joon, I turn the screen over to you. Oh, you're mute.
Thank you, James, for that generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me again to the Cutting Edge series. It's just a wonderful event, being able to talk to so many bright young students. and the eminent faculty. Yeah, it's a bit of a shame that we are still doing this on screen, but hopefully that in the future I should be able to do it in person. So today I'm going to talk about the political economy of Parasite, the movie. Well, sometimes the people have sent around the news about this talk without the movie. So a friend of mine in Korea sent me an email saying, when did you get into the pathology, the political economy of Parasite? Are you going to talk about malaria? And I said, no, it's about the movie. So let me begin hang on, with my PowerPoint slide. Can you see it? Is it okay? Yeah, so the movie Parasite is the first ever foreign language movie to be awarded the Academy Award in the United States, and it has caused quite a stir. It's a very, very accomplished piece of work, uniquely mixing social commentary with comedy and also horror. I hope most of you have watched this movie before coming to this, but I hope all of you will watch it maybe more than once after my talk, because once you understand the context behind it, you will appreciate the movie even more. You know, this movie is set in Korea, South Korea, official title Republic of Korea, which is my native country. And it is a country that has gone from being one of the poorest in the world to one of the richest within really less than a person's lifetime. So back in 1961, on the eve of the country's, the start of the country's economic development drive, which started with 5-year development plan in 1962, South Korea's per capita income was $93. Okay, it wasn't as poor as some countries like Nepal and Haiti, but its income was basically at the same level with other major developing economies like India, Kenya, and Nigeria. All the Latin American countries were richer than Korea, some of them way richer. I think in that year, Argentina's per capita income was something like $400. Many African countries were considerably richer. You know, Ghana had the per capita income more than twice bigger. Senegal had the income that was almost at 3.5 times. So it was one of the poorest countries in the world at the time. Today is one of the richest countries with per capita income of about 31,000 in 2019. It is just under 10% below the EU average, and considerably richer than the poorer Western European countries. And we are not talking about the new Eastern European the members of the EU, you know, richer than Spain, richer than Portugal, richer than Greece. Now, this means that there are around 8 million Koreans who remember living like an average Nigerian or Indian of the early 60s, not even of today, who now live like an average EU citizen. I say 8 million because this is the number of Koreans who are over 65 today. So those who were born before 1955. I mean, I adopted this cutoff line because few people remember much about what happened before they are 5 or 6. So I'm excluding those who were alive in 1961. I wasn't. I was born in 63. but were under 5. So there are 8 million people who literally can remember living like a Nigerian or an Indian in the early 60s, who are now living like an average EU citizen. This is a remarkable achievement, but even more remarkable is the fact that this the increase in income was achieved on the basis of a radical transformation of the country's production structure and capabilities. There are countries that have become rich suddenly because they found oil. But in the case of Korea, it was based on a fundamental transformation of the productive structure and capabilities. So in the early 60s, the main export items of Korea was primary commodities, tungsten ore, rice, fish. Even until the mid-80s, after more than 2 decades of so-called miracle economic growth, the country's main exports were still the labor-intensive products like textile, stitched garments, trainers, and stuffed toys, although by this time it started exporting more high-tech products like steel and electronics and automobile, but they were not so prominent. Of course, today's main exports include sophisticated manufacturing products like semiconductors, mobile phones, and automobiles. And I think the best way to kind of present the magnitude of the structural transformation that went on in the country is to talk about the Korean car manufacturer Hyundai. The Hyundai Business Group was founded in the late 1940s. Its main business was basically construction. From the 60s, it wanted to diversify into higher productivity activities. So one of the things that it did was to form a joint venture with Ford, the American car company, to manufacture cars. Now, manufacture, I think, is a bit of an overstatement there, because at the time, what they basically did was to import this semi-knockdown kits from America and put them together with minimal, although not no use of domestically sourced parts, and selling those assembled cars to the Korean market. The model was called Cortina, and they produced not even 3,000 cars per year. And they continued that for a few years. But then in 1973, the Korean government made the announcement saying that all the car companies will have their license canceled if they don't come up with a locally designed car model. And at the time, there were like 3 or 4 automobile manufacturers, all joint ventured with some foreign company. Most of them left. General Motors stuck around with this Korean partner. But the Ford, Hyundai's partner, left thinking this is a ridiculous idea. But somehow Hyundai produced a local model called Pony. There's a very basic car, more of a kind of 4 wheels and an ashtray kind of a thing. And started producing it from 1976, where they started in very late 1975. But in the first full year of production, they produced just over 10,000 Pony cars. Yeah, 10,000 is a lot more than 3,000 they used to produce with Cortina. But in the same year, to give you the perspective, General Motors produced 4.8 million cars, and Ford produced 1.9 million cars. So just think about it. If you had a time machine and went back to 1976 and told people that, oh, there's this totally unknown car maker in Korea. Well, really little more than a glorified car mechanic shop, which has a currently production run that is 0.2% of General Motors and 0.5% of Ford. But in just over 30 years, this company will be bigger than Ford. And in less than 40 years, it will be bigger than General Motors. People from 1976 would have tried to put you in a mental institution. But this is exactly what happened. As from 2009, Hyundai produced more cars than Ford, and it overtook General Motors in 2015. So this is the kind of transformation of productive structure and capabilities that we are talking about. From one of the poorest countries, almost totally dependent on the export of primary commodities, jumping to be one of the richest countries, overtaking some of the greatest companies in the history of capitalism, like General Motors and Ford. And not just in automobile, but in semiconductor, in the electronics, everywhere. Another the amusing story is that the Korean the company LG, the king of the display market, started out as the lowest grade subcontractor for RCA, the American company that almost single-handedly invented the color TV. But when RCA went bankrupt somewhere in the mid-2000s, I think, a big chunk of it was bought by LG. Yeah? So it's a bit like, I don't know, in some big latifundia in the Argentina or Chile, the lowest the campesino 30 years later turns up and buys half of the farm because the farm was not managed very well. Anyway, what is also very impressive is that the benefits of this rapid economic growth and development were rather evenly distributed. During the so-called miracle growth period between the 1960s and mid-1990s, Korea remained one of the most equal countries in the developing world, where it belonged at the time, although it was still quite unequal by the standard of the rich countries. Moreover, despite rapid industrialization and rapid structural transformation, which often causes greater inequality, income inequality actually stayed the same or maybe slightly increased, depending on which data you look at, between the mid-60s and mid-80s. And inequality even fell for about a decade between mid-1980s and mid-1990s. So, when I was a student, especially the World Bank used to talk about growth with equity, this was the prime example of that. Yeah? So all in all, Korea's achievement over the last 60 years has been remarkable, but unfortunately, things have gone terribly wrong with the country these days. The most damning indication is that the country has one of the 10 highest suicide rates in the world. Within the rich world, in the OECD, actually it used to have the highest suicide rate by far until 2015. I mean, it joined the OECD in 1995, maybe 96, thereabout. So between that and 2015, it had suicide rate that is depending on the year, 2.5, sometimes 3 times higher than the OECD average. In 2015, Lithuania joined the OECD, and it has even higher suicide rate than Korea. So Korea was knocked off the throne. Well, throne. Yeah, unfortunately, Koreans never do things by half. They have to be number one in everything they do. So good things, but also bad things like suicide. Huh? Suicide is particularly high among older people over 50. So for this age group, the average suicide rate could be something like 4 times higher than the OECD average of the same age group. While the old are killing themselves in droves, the young are in despair. The young call their country Hell Joseon. Joseon is the name of the country under the last dynasty, and it is actually the name still preferred by North Korea. So Hell Joseon means hell that is Korea, Korea that is hell. According to some opinion surveys, half of the younger people, like between the 20 and 40, say they want to migrate to another country if they have a chance. The cultural world is brimming with books and dramas aimed at young people, telling them that it is okay not to be okay. Yeah? Now, this is the most worrying thing, that people are encouraged to embrace that unhappiness, yeah? Because there's no way that they can become happy, at least by the standard measures. Yeah? Young people have stopped having children. In 2018, Korea had a fertility rate of 0.98. Once again, number one from the bottom by some significant margin. I think in 2019, it went down even further to something like 0.85. So there's a huge crisis there. I mean, falling fertility itself is one thing, but the reason is behind this fertility decline is the worrying thing. That people just don't see the hope for the future. And it is this new Korea, if you like, not the Korea of miracle growth, that is depicted in the movie Parasite. Well, the most important theme of this movie is, of course, inequality, as many of you know. And inequality is a very common theme in movies from around the world. These are some of my favorite movies about inequality. City of God, the Brazilian movie, Roma, the Mexican one, Daniel Blake, the British one. But the story of Parasite is a very Korean story of inequality. And I'll explain that why I say that in due course. Korea is currently one of the most unequal countries in the rich world. Only the United States is consistently more unequal than Korea among countries with more than $30,000 per capita income. Sometimes Korea is knocked off from its second place by United Kingdom, sometimes by Israel, occasionally by New Zealand, but basically it's one of the 4 least equal countries in the rich world. The important thing here is that this high inequality is actually quite a recent phenomenon. Of course, there was a high inequality in Korea during the feudal period, during the Japanese colonial rule, but on the eve of the economic miracle in the early 60s, the country actually had quite equal income distribution, once again by the standard of the developing countries. because there were a lot of upheavals in the country. So the Japanese colonial rule, although it created a certain class of the rich people who were associated with the Japanese and heightened inequality, when the colonial rule ended, a lot of these people lost their wealth. And then there was the war effort during the Second World War, during which the Japanese squeezed everyone. And then there was the Korean War, which destroyed a lot of the facilities. A lot of factories were destroyed, for example. And then there was also the significant land reform in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which created quite the unequal society. And I said earlier, inequality didn't rise during the miracle years. If it rose, it was at very little, and there was a significant fall for about a decade between the mid-80s and mid-90s. But this began to change from the mid-90s. Now, in order to understand this change, you need to understand how Korea kept its inequality low. Unlike the rich nations, other rich nations, I should put, Korea didn't keep inequality low by redistributing income through tax and transfer system, or the welfare state, if you will. The welfare state in Korea was negligible until the 1980s and was very small even in the 1990s. The welfare state measured by social spending as defined by the OECD as a proportion of GDP was a mere 2.7% in 1990 and 3.1% of GDP in 1995. To put things into perspective, today, even the US, which is supposed to have a small welfare state, spends about 18.7% of GDP on social spending. OECD average is 20%, so 3% the spending is minuscule. However, Korea kept its inequality low by restraining the ability of the market to generate inequality in the first place. So there were protection for small farms. So after the land reform, there was a very strict ceiling on agricultural land ownership. I think because the country had very high population, has very high population density, the ceiling was something ridiculously small, like 1 hectare, which is basically a handkerchief size. And farmers were given the protection from foreign agriculture import. Import of rice was banned altogether. The import of other agricultural products were very strictly controlled. So the small farmers that had the space to survive. There were very strong protection of small shops. Basically, if you wanted to open a large retail space, you are denied the license. So the countries are full of what we call 구멍가게, which literally means hole in the wall shops. So they look like this. I mean, tiny shop selling everything from cigarette to energy drink to milk to the snacks to the alcohol. Yeah, the funny thing is that these small shops are often called super or super, short for supermarkets. So actually, the supermarkets are super small markets in Korea, and the large supermarkets that are spreading around the country these days are calling themselves marts. because if you call yourself super or supermarket, it means that you are tiny. So that's the Korean cultural core. Small firms, of course, in general, the large firms owned by these big conglomerates like Hyundai and Samsung and LG were favored by the government, but it also provided these spaces in which small firms can survive. So the government until 1997 had this the law, which was basically the list of industries reserved for small and medium-sized enterprises. And these were basically the low-tech industries. So if you're a large company, you couldn't make tofu, for example. You couldn't mill rice, because these were all considered jobs for small companies. Workers were, of course, brutally exploited and maltreated, but even so, there was some protection against the firing. Actually, at least in legal terms, firing was not easy. Also, the agency workers were highly restricted. So, companies couldn't use many outsourced agency workers. Also, there was the practice of lifetime employment for regular workers in large companies, not as widespread or strict as in Japan, but if you are working for one of these big companies, you could expect lifetime employment. There was at the other end of the spectrum, there was financial repression, in the sense that there's a ban or strong restrictions on speculative finance, which limited the possibilities of large earnings. There are cultural caps on top salaries. So, even the top executives of the largest companies probably were not getting, more than $1 or $2 million. So in this way, it kept, in technical terms, market distribution very equal. And even today, even these days, South Korea is the second most equal country in terms of the distribution of market income. Actually, it used to be the most equal country in terms of market income distribution. That is income before tax and transfer. But for reasons I'll explain that in a few minutes, it has its market income distribution has become more unequal, and it conceded that recently the space to Switzerland, which actually has many of these protections for the weak that I'm talking about in the Korean context. The trouble is it may have a quite equal distribution of market income, but there's hardly any distribution going on, redistribution going on, so that it ends up being very unequal after that you do the tax and redistribution. Now, in the miracle years, the combination of the protection of the weak, restraint of the strong, was crucially supplemented by, by the extended family network. Yeah, no, let me phrase it again. I need to bring in more stuff here. So it had the restraints on market forces, but very little the welfare state. But during the miracle years, this wasn't causing a huge problem, because on the one hand, you had rapid economic growth and creation of a lot of jobs, and increasingly better jobs. So the people were quite protected from the shocks of unemployment. At the same time, you still had this traditional extended family network, which would support you in times of difficulty. So you, I don't know, fell sick, and maybe your brother will pay for your children's tuition while you cannot work during your illness. Yeah. Maybe you get unemployed and can't quite find a job quickly. Maybe your uncle will support you for a couple of months. So with the help of a rapidly growing economy and extended family network, people could protect themselves from shocks of life, unemployment, illness, retirement, and what have you, which the welfare state protect you against. So during the miracle years, that people had quite a hopeful outlook. Life was tough. It had the longest working hours in the world during those days, 55, even 60 hours per week. Of course, this is nothing compared to what British workers were putting in, the other European workers were putting in during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, the British factory workers typically work for 80 hours a week. Some of them work 100 hours, but still, I mean, by the standard of the mid 20th century, Korea had really long working hours. There was a lot of violence at the workplace. The foreman will hit you, kick you, harass you. But people had hope. Life was getting better all the time for most people. That if something goes wrong, there'll be the extended family to take care of you. And this the sense of hope is reflected in suicide statistics. I told you that since the mid 1990s, Korea's suicide rate was by far the highest in the OECD, but that just before it shot up in the mid 1990s, it actually had a suicide rate that was below the OECD average. So something fundamentally changed in the mid to late 1990s, and that is basically this wave of deregulation that came in the 1990s. So in 1993, the country's first fully civilian government comes to power. The fully civilian government in 32 years comes to power, and it starts implementing liberalization measures, especially in the financial sector, the agricultural sector, and the labor market. The main force driving these liberalization measures were the chaebols, the large conglomerates, which wanted to break away from the restraints put on them by the state. Of course, they grew up on the state support, the generous financing and the granting of monopoly rights and what have you. But now that they could, well, they thought they could stand on their own feet, they didn't want restrictions put on to them by the state. They wanted to expand into areas that were kept away from them, especially the retail sector. And they wanted the government to deregulate the labor market so that they can be more free in using the workers. And this push for liberalization by the chaebols was actually helped by the fact that most people at the time associated interventionist government policies with military dictatorship, because that's what the military dictatorship did, and thought that political liberalization also required economic liberalization. So there was a widespread support for these measures. This liberalization trend vastly accelerated with the 1997 financial crisis. Never mind the fact that the 97 crisis was mainly caused by the premature and poorly designed financial liberalization measures of the mid-1990s. Whatever the cause was, following the crisis, the US and other rich countries used the IMF risk program that Korea was subject to as a lever to open up and liberalize Korean markets, especially the financial market. Many chaebol that went bankrupt during the crisis, but those who survived continued with their pressure on the government so that they could expand their business in areas like retail and further deregulate the labor market. They also largely did away with the lifetime employment practice, using the crisis as an excuse while ditching the old kind of implicit norm on the top salaries. So now that you have Korean CEOs that are being paid $60, $70 million, unlike in the old days. And somewhat unexpected political alliance during this period, former left-wing activists joined forces with the internationalized upper professional class, financiers, lawyers, and accountants to campaign for further liberalization of the financial market, as they saw this as the most effective way to restrain the power of the chaebols by inviting foreign capital. And one of the results of these neoliberal reforms is the intensification of the inequality problem, as depicted in the movie Parasite. Now, I need to explain how this has exactly happened. So first of all, the neoliberal policies brought about slow growth. Now, some of you might think this is strange because isn't neoliberalism supposed to be a doctrine of growth machismo? Unfortunately, the reality is that neoliberalism is not good for economic growth. It discourages economic growth as it creates an excessively liquid financial market that discourages long-term oriented investment. Heightened inequality that it creates also reduces investment and growth by increasing political instability and depressing demand. This is why during the so-called the neoliberal period since the 1980s, the world economy has grown at barely over half the speed that used to between the 1950s and the 70s. So between the 1950s and the 70s, the world economy was growing at 2.6% per year in per capita terms. Since then, it has been growing at 1.5%. In the Korean case too, the economy grew much more slowly after the neoliberal reform, but during the miracle years, it was growing at 6% per year. Since then, it has been struggling to grow even at 3%. I'm talking in per capita terms. Slow growth meant a much more slow creation of employment, and this has resulted in higher youth unemployment, but also early redundancy of older workers in their early 50s or even late 40s. And when they became redundant, these older workers could not rely on the welfare state because the welfare state was very small. So they couldn't be like other workers in Scandinavia who could rely on the welfare state to finance their retraining and find a new and hopefully better job. At the same time, rapid industrialization, urbanization had brought about the disintegration of the traditional extended family, which used to act as a quasi-welfare state. In the meantime, the welfare state has grown very slowly. Despite a substantial growth in the last decade or so, the Korean welfare state is still the smallest in the rich world. In the OECD, there are a few countries which has smaller welfare state than Korea, but these are countries that all have income that is half, 1/3, or even less that of Korea's. So among the rich countries, it has the smallest welfare state. I'm not going to go into the figures. So the only option left to them is to use their severance payments to set up their own businesses. As a result, despite rapid industrialization and expansion of large firms, there's a very high self-employment rate in Korea. It's still nearly 25%. EU average is 15%. It's at only 10% in Japan. In the US, it's 6%. That's quite interesting because Americans think they are all entrepreneurs, but it's actually the least entrepreneurial country in the world. The least proportion of people are actually their own bosses in the US, in the world. And many of these self-employed people are concentrated in the small restaurants and bars, which people who have been to Korea must have recognized to be so numerous. About 10 years ago, I remember seeing this article saying that Korea has the largest number of fried chicken shops per capita in the world, despite being barely in the top 10 of chicken consumption per capita. So these are the small bars, restaurants that dot the streets. People are flocking to these sectors because restraints on market forces still are quite strong in those sectors. Unfortunately, we have seen in the last couple of decades gradual but relentless progress of deregulation, and these small retail shops, small restaurants, small bars, they're really losing their ground. Small shops are being pushed out by supermarkets. Large-scale restaurant chains are driving out small restaurants. And indeed, these large supermarket and restaurant chains are often owned by one of the chaebols. But you have to get in there because there's nowhere else to go. And now we finally entered some scenes of the Parasite, from the snippets of conversation that you hear in the taxi driver's buffet restaurant that this family goes, that the poor Kim family goes. You learn that Kitak, the head of that family, failed in no less than 2 of these ventures. One was the fried chicken, the other was Chinese Castella. Now this Castella is a very strange thing. It's supposed to have come from some Portuguese type of cake, but it came to Asia through Portugal's trade and imperial link, and it's very popular in Japan and Taiwan, which had links with Portugal in the old days. And in the mid-2010s, in 2015-16, there was a huge craze about this Chinese version of this Castella. And a lot of people got into that business. And in 2017, there was a big scandal because some of the companies that were selling the franchises of this Chinese Castella shops, I mean, there were more than one. I mean, there were quite a few shops that companies that are selling franchise in these shops. I mean, many of them went bankrupt, and the whole country was in uproar. But I mean, there are so many of these ephemerally the popular things that in the mid 2000s there's a craze about Malaysian coffee buns around the 2000 mid 2010s. I remember seeing a lot of shops selling Brazilian pound queijo. Now there are very few left, you know. So I mean, people keep getting into this business and failing. And if you fail, not just in one, but two of these businesses, like this guy has, then yeah, it's not a surprise that you end up at that you know, semi-basement flat folding the pizza boxes. Later in the movie, we learned that this guy Kunze, the guy who was living secretly in the basement of the rich Park family's mansion, also failed in the fried chicken, the Chinese Castella venture. So they briefly shared solidarity in failing in the same thing. And in the recently popular drama series called the Squid Game, we learned that this guy Ki-hoon also failed in the fried chicken restaurant, and that's was the beginning of his ballooning debt, which kind of drove him into this the ridiculous survival game. So behind the descent of the Kim and the Kim family and the family of this guy Kunze, I forgot his surname, lay the political economic inequality of neoliberal Korea. Basically, neoliberal reforms slow down economic growth and reduce the number of stable and well-paying jobs. Those reforms also had reduced legal protection of workers from firing, while vastly weakening the norm of lifetime employment. So a large cohort of older workers in their late 40s and early 50s, like these guys, were forced into redundancy. And in the absence of a decent welfare state and the disintegration of traditional extended family, these workers swelled the ranks of self-employed. But many of these self-employed people were driven into bankruptcy because neoliberal reforms were weakening the protection of small shops and restaurants that used to be provided. And the result was descent into abject poverty, interspersed with casual employment like substitute driving. I mean, this guy used to do that in the Squid Game. We also learned that he used to do that. Or low-skilled piecework like folding pizza boxes, as the Kim family does in Parasite. An additional glimpse into the Korean inequality story that you get from Parasite is the role of education in the reproduction of inequality. In the movie, the first entry by the poor Kim family into the rich Park family is provided by the chance hiring of Kyu, the son of the Kim family, as a private tutor for Dae-hye, the daughter of the Park family. In today's Korea, private tutoring, or at least attending a hagwon, that is a cramming school, so it's not a personal tutoring, but this extracurricular schools that teach you stuff that your school don't have time to teach, or the resources to teach. In today's Korea, private tutoring is so important in getting admissions into better universities, and in turn, attendance of better universities vastly increase your chance of getting better paying and more secure jobs, strongly determining your future. Some of you might have seen that the other Korean drama series on Netflix called Sky Castle, which very well depicts this aspect of Korean education competition. Of course, even in the old days, there were hagwons, there were private tutors, but they were not as nearly important as they are today, because the university entrance exams at the time were more primitive. Yeah? What I mean is that in those days, a lot of tests were very simplistic multiple choice tests, And even when it wasn't multiple choice, raw intelligence that enabled you to do well in a few key subjects like Korean, English, and math would get you into good university. So there was relatively little advantage that you could get from private tutoring or hagwon. So during those days, your family background had relatively little impact on your education achievement and thus your subsequent labor market performance. Of course, that is over and above the usual advantage that the kids from richer, better educated families get from, well, being better fed, having a quieter environment, better educational support from the parents. But beyond those obvious things that the extra resources spent on tutoring and so on had relatively little impact. So to put it a bit dramatically, in the old Korea, it was possible for you to be born in a poorest peasant family and make it right to the very top of the society. Supreme Court judge, CEO of a major corporation, top scientist, neurosurgeon in a big hospital, you name it. Yeah, a lot of people in their the 50s, 60s, and 70s who are in high-ranking positions in Korea are from such background. Yeah? However, these days, both school exams and university entrance exams have become much more sophisticated. So you need a lot of coaching in exam-taking skills to do well in this test. Moreover, in the name of selecting more rounded individuals, universities take into account extracurricular activities, which give huge advantages to children from wealthier families. They can pay for private tutoring that will get their children to get a prize in International Math Olympiad. They can organize impressive internships in university labs, the international law firms and investment banks using the social connections. They can provide them with, I don't know, opportunities to volunteer in the orphanages or even have them sent to some poor country in Asia or Africa and spend a few months working in the local community, Well, I mean, I guess this part of my point sounds familiar to the American audience, where the extracurricular activities are considered very important. So now the education system is organized in such a way that family income and wealth have much greater influence on educational attainment and thus one's economic position in the long run. In the context of rising inequality, the inequalizing effect of this system is even more magnified. But despite this, the myth of social mobility through a meritocratic education system persists, partly because it had worked so well in the past. So people can't quite just believe that it's not working anymore. But also because those who benefit from it have an interest in sustaining the myth. Yeah? So they can spend enormous amount of resources to help their children to get into good universities and do well there. But then they can defend the social outcome by saying that, well, my kid studied hard and did well in the university. What are you talking about? Without mentioning that this was in the significant part the result of the resources they poured in. The increasing importance of family background in social mobility has probably not yet reached the level you see in countries like the US or the UK, but the fact that this has been increasing rapidly in the last couple of decades has created a strong sense of hopelessness among the young generation. And on top of increasing inequality itself, this sense of hopelessness about the future is what is behind the talk of Hell Joseon, the collapse in fertility, and the increasing popularity of the idea of becoming happier by embracing unhappiness. So let me conclude. As so dramatically and masterfully depicted in Parasite, the problem of inequality, poverty, and falling social mobility, and the resulting sense of frustration and hopelessness is pushing the Korean society to a breaking point. One way to deal with this problem may be to restore some elements of the old system, especially reversing some deregulation measures to protect the weak. And there is a lot of call for that. But the forces of deregulation in this regard are too strong to be reversed, not least because consumers benefit from having large, more efficient retailers and restaurant chains that serving them. So actually, many people want to be served by the more efficient, modernized restaurant chains and the shops rather than this the traditional 구멍가게 or the local the second-rate local chicken shops. Yeah. Also, the old protection-based system is unfair on those who do not have the numerical importance or organizational power to acquire protection. So I think the problems of Korea today have to be mainly dealt with by the constructing of a citizenship-based welfare state that befits the country's level of economic development and social conditions. Of course, I'm not saying that we can just copy the, I don't know, the Finnish or Swedish welfare state and be done with it. You know, that for one thing, we have very high rate of self-employment, so that you need special measures to cover those people that usually not covered very well by the standard welfare state measures. And this should be complemented by a reform of the education system in a way that reduces the influence of family income on educational achievements. And strengthening of the welfare state will also have the impact of reducing the achievement gap between students that come from different family backgrounds. And without these changes, I think Korea runs the danger of becoming a nation that has a brilliant past, but a bleak future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hajun. That was, as usual, extremely enlightening. And I'm sure it's going to provoke, already we're having questions coming into the chat. Francisco Pereira.
Right. My turn, is it, James?
Yeah, and thanks very much.
Okay. Let me just try to get my screen shared here in one moment.
And as Francisco's doing that, Hajun, when you come back, I really would like you to say something about going forward, breaking up tribals, stronger welfare state. What's happening with the trade unions?
Mm-hmm.
Francisco.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation to be here, and thanks to Hajun for this great talk, and also for giving me an excuse to watch Parasite again, which I did this week, and really enjoyed seeing it again. It's really just such a great film. Now, I cannot contribute much to the conversation about Korea with someone like Hajun. I don't know the country almost at all, and he is a real expert on it. So what I thought I'd do is just reflect a little bit on some of the numbers that we have about inequality and the realities depicted in the movie, and the sort of puzzle that they lay out. So what you've got here on this screen is what Miles Korak and then Alan Kruger called the Great Gatsby curve, which may be familiar to many of you. It's the relationship across countries between inequality in incomes And in the original form of the curve, it's mobility, intergenerational mobility, which I've replaced here with something quite similar to it, which is just a measure of inequality of opportunity, which we don't need to discuss the details of it. But you can think of it as basically mobility. And if we had mobility, it would look much the same. And the point of the curve, the reason it became, it's just a cross-section, it's just a scatter plot that Miles put together. But the reason it became such a big thing, and Barack Obama talked about it and so on, is that it kind of puts the lie to the myth, the idea initially hypothesized by Milton Friedman. I'm not accusing him of lying, he didn't have the data, but Milton Friedman said, well, it's okay if a market system develops a lot of inequality so long as it has mobility. If everybody has a chance and people can move around, this generation, I'm rich, the next generation, your child is rich, and it's okay. And it postulated or hypothesized that the US was a high mobility country, so it didn't matter that the inequality was higher elsewhere. And of course, what the graph shows is that the relationship is not negative, it's positive. Countries with more inequality have more inequality of opportunity or lower mobility, right? And here, you've got the Latin American countries, you've got South Africa, you've got the US at the very top for rich countries. Well, where's Korea? Korea is down here, a little bit like how June already warned us. Its inequality in income is not very high. It's along the other rich countries in the OECD, much lower than in the US and so on. And the measure that we have of inequality of opportunity is also not very high, at least at that time. I thought to myself, well, some time ago I had to talk about Chile. Here's Chile and the social protests. And this was another country that did well, didn't do as well as Korea. No country really has done, I think, perhaps the exception of China coming up, but in terms of development. But Chile was a success story for Latin American standards. And then we had this massive protests, right, which people associated with inequality, even though inequality in incomes had been falling. So part of my argument about the link between inequality in Chile and social protests was that as a country develops, it becomes harder and harder to sustain those kinds of very high inequality. There is this thing here I called the inequality and development empty zone. June actually in his talk also talked about countries above $30,000 in GDP per capita. And the point I'm making here, just as a simple description of the data, is that the only country in this rectangle, i.e. with a Gini above 0.4 and an income per capita above 30,000 is actually the US. And even the US wasn't there before, hasn't been there for long. It's moved back up here from below. So the idea is that as a country develops, and the causality here, we're not going to get into multiple directions of causality, but one way of putting this is that successful social contracts that allow institutions to arise that have a country develop into this kind of levels of income are inconsistent with extreme inequality, such as a Gini above 0.4. And one of the things I was talking about Chile was, well, look, it's approaching this area here from the. So I wonder to myself, is Korea the same? And it's not. Korea is already down here. It's already in this more developed area, and it's not doing that badly in terms of the numbers. Perhaps some of the growth in inequality that Hajun was talking about isn't here yet. This last data that I have for Korea is 2016, and it's actually quite a lot below Spain and Italy. While Hajun was talking, I looked on my other screen, and the data from the World Bank does confirm that Spain and Italy, as well as Great Britain and so on, are actually slightly above Korea here, as well, of course, as the US. And yet, if you watch the movie, which I hope you've all done, there is no question that it depicts, incredibly stark inequalities. And my favorite sequence for that, my favorite scene for that is actually the one where they manage to escape the house, the park. The Kims managed to escape the park house after the Parks come back from the failed picnic, or the failed camping trip, rather, in the middle of this deluge, the middle of this downpour. And what happens is they go home. But they're going home, which is maybe 2 minutes in the movie, is a sequence of going down, down, down. They go down this, this street, then they go down these stairs and those stairs and down a tunnel and the other stairs. And of course, the water is going with them, and then it leads to that flood. So it's a marvelous depiction of that kind of inequality. So the puzzle is, how do those inequalities sit with these numbers? Well, one thing is that the numbers may be a little bit old, maybe worse now than we see. The numbers are incomplete in some ways. But there are a couple of other things, and I want to talk about three contrasts just very quickly before asking a question to Hajun and others about China. So the first contrast is a contrast between absolute and relative inequality, which in fact I was just talking to some students about yesterday. If you take the Gini coefficient that I showed you, or a tile index, or most other measures of inequality, they're relative. If you multiply everybody's income by 10, inequality doesn't change. But if you multiply the Park's income by 10 and the Kim's income by 10, the absolute gap, the difference, goes up massively. And in Korea, with the growth that we've seen over the last 60 years, which Hajun described, those very stark numbers from 1960s to now, there has been a lot of growth. Maybe the Gini has stayed around 30%. It may have gone up a bit, down a bit, but the absolute gaps are enormous. The older generation did not see absolute gaps anywhere near this. And this is a point that others have made before, Martin Ravalian amongst them, about just the fact that when we think, relative inequality is not changing in this particular country, relative inequality may not be changing, but if there is a lot of growth, absolute differences are changing, and that matters to how people feel. Other kind of contrast between two kinds of inequality I want to mention is in the difference between inequality of wealth and what I'm calling inequality of recognition or social treatment. And it struck me, now if you haven't watched the movie and you're going to watch it, this is a spoiler alert, turn down your volume because I'm going to refer to something that happens at the end of the movie. So there's this gigantic gap between the two families, the two, quote, parasite families, the Kim family and the ones that were originally down there, the original maid and her husband. The gap between them and the Parks is enormous in wealth. But that's not what really upsets them. The reason, and here's the spoiler alert, right? The reason Mr. Kim in the end, all the bloodshed in the end is, for one thing, is amongst the poorer families trying to kill one another off. But when Mr. Kim does eventually just flip out and knives Mr. Park, it is because of Mr. Park's repeated mentions of his smell, which he always does, of course, when he doesn't think Mr. Kim is listening. But what really bugs Mr. Kim more than anything else is this sense that there is, this upper class thinks he smells bad. There is a kind of the smell of the semi-basement, the smell of the public transport. There's a kind of a social kind of inequality that seems to matter more than actually the inequality between the two houses in terms of how it affects people. So that's just a thought that I'd love Hajun's comments on and those of others. My third point is related to something Hajun already talked about, is the trouble with meritocracy. And it's very much related to the description of educational systems that no longer provide the same educational opportunities to people. So the first thing about meritocracy is it is not the same as equality of opportunity. So if the Park's children have all their tutoring and have access to better schools, and then have access to an excellent college and then go for a postgraduate degree in the United States. They keep talking about the United States a lot in that house, right? And then comes back and gets a great job that's like his dad's job. That's not really, that is, in some sense, maybe meritocracy in the narrow sense that, the best person may have been chosen for the job, but it is not equality of opportunity in that, people from other backgrounds never had a chance of competing for that job. So that distinction is something I feel people often miss. Meritocracy, in the simple sense of giving the best people, choosing the best people for the job or for the opportunity, is not the same as equality of opportunity when there is a lot of inheritance of privilege and advantage and disadvantage, at the other hand, between generations, right? And yet, and that's the second bullet under point 3, if the culture is such that you think you are living in a meritocratic world, and I put here, if you have this belief in a just world, which is a reference to a paper 2006 by Benabou in Tirol. If you think you are in that just world, then failure is particularly damaging to self-respect. And I wonder if this, the suicide statistics in Korea that I didn't know about, that Ha-Jun mentioned, his sentence about it's okay not to be okay, they're reminiscent of these deaths of despair work that Deaton and Case have done in the United States, right? And if you take a country like my own, Brazil, where we are convinced we don't live in a meritocracy, we know that the people who are doing well, it's not necessarily because they worked hard, it's probably because they were lucky and they were born in a nice place. I was in a Latin American event the other day, and somebody said, that somebody used to say in Africa, what country they were, maybe Mexico. I think it was Mexico. And they said, look, there are 2 times in your life when you can get rich, when you're born and when you marry. Okay? So if you live in a world like that and you don't do well, you don't blame yourself. It's the system. This is why we're not killing ourselves as much. And the Europeans aren't either compared to the Americans. So I wonder whether, Korea is more, and this is really a question because I don't know anything about Korea really, but it's maybe more like the United States, where there is this ingrained belief in meritocracy, which means that you have terrible loss of self-respect if you don't do well. So that's just a thought of that. And then my last question really that I'll end is, of course, this tutoring stuff that we see in the movie and which Ha-Jun discussed, it's impossible to see that now and not think of everything we've been reading about Xi Jinping's government's backlash against the tutoring industry in China, which goes along with some sort of backlash against his bigger tycoons. I'm not going to go here and defend Xi Jinping or the Chinese government about many of the things they're doing, and many of their backlashes and repressions, I think, are just awful. But I do think that maybe there is a concern there with avoiding this kind of Korean trajectory of entrenching inequality of opportunity again by allowing that kind of thing. So I just wondered about, for the discussion about Ha-Jun's thoughts on that, but also other people in the audience. And with that, I'll end and thank you very much again for the opportunity to share this.
Francisco, thank you so much. Just before we go to the open Q&A, Ha-Jun, would you like to come back for just a brief response? And then we'll go to the lots of questions. In the Q&A.
Thank you, Francisco. Your points are all great. First of all, the inequality data that I have mainly used from the OECD. So maybe their data are different from the World Bank data. So I'm not a specialist on inequality, so I don't know how good or bad OECD data is compared to the others. But since I'm trying to combine it with the discussions on the welfare state, I relied on the OECD data. So that's probably where the difference comes from. The point about the absolute inequality, I think is very important. I hadn't quite thought about that, so we should look at it. But I think the thing about inequality is that it matters because you think you belong to some place. If someone is angry about inequality in Korea, you try to go to that person and say, "Oh, inequality is a lot higher in Brazil, so you should be happy." Probably you'll be lucky if you're not hit, because basically what matters in inequality more. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter at all, but what matters far more in terms of inequality is time series rather than cross section. So how inequality has changed, and in that looking at those changes is not just about the Gini coefficient, some objective data, but how people perceive it, how people see the future, and how they are predicting the future. And you already made a very important point that this belief in a just world might actually make people more frustrated. And that definitely is the case in Korea, because with the flattening of social hierarchy through Japanese colonialism, the 2 wars, and land reform and so on, the country has a very strong egalitarian spirit. And until recently, there wasn't even cultural difference between people of different classes, because even many of the rich people are fresh from the countryside, that they, of course, have left it 40 years ago and what have you, but, it's not like in Brazil, not like in England. These families haven't been rich for the centuries. Yeah? I mean, I once was reading a detective story set in the kind of aristocratic family in the UK, and this the aristocrat was looking down upon a lesser aristocrat because he has to put his own clothes. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't have a servant to put that clothes on him. So and then the British people often talk about the people who buy furniture and who inherit them. Yeah, I mean, Korea doesn't have that kind of social distinction. I'm sure it will develop with this continuous increase in inequality unless we do something. But so far, it hasn't been like that. So you are very right, Francisco. I mean, you think those guys are the same as I am, and the system is meritocracy, and I have failed. It's awful. Yeah? So I think a lot of it is about history. A lot of it is about the changes, and maybe even the kind of how you think it will change in the coming days. Yeah, finally, your point that meritocracy is not the same as the equality of opportunity. Yeah, I think equality of opportunity is quite a slippery concept to define. I mean, the minimalist definition will be everyone plays by the same rule. You know? So like in a race, no one has a head start. Everyone has to start from the same place. But it wouldn't be a fair race if some of the contestants are actually disabled. You know? This is why we have Olympics and Paralympics separate. So I think that concept has been very often abused. But even if you can truly achieve the equality of opportunity in the sense of the contestants being, equally capable, in some broad sense, that if they are equally capable in the strict sense, there'll be no winner. I think that your point that even that is not the same as meritocracy is a very good one. Thank you.
Thank you, Hajun. Okay, I'm going to go right away into questions, and if it's okay with both of you, we'll take 3 questions. And I'm really delighted to see some of our alumni have joined us on YouTube. So I'm going to ask, so welcome to Hamza and Zohar and Lara. I'm going to ask Greta to read out their questions.
Hello. Yes, our alumni are very excited about this talk. And so all 3 questions from YouTube. Hamza is asking, well, first of all, acknowledging your work and its importance, and particularly complimenting you on making development scholarship accessible, and is asking you, what are your thoughts on the role of taxation in reducing inequality in the developing world? Zohar is asking, do you think there's still a legacy of the 2-caste system evident in Korean society that might restrain social policies that promote social mobility? And Lara Abiona has a bit of a longer question around social norms in South Korea and their relation to class and inequality. They're asking that, I recall in the film that the wealthy husband/father often measured his domestic staff by the degree to which they crossed the line, as it was translated from Korean to English. Does this phrase and/or the context in which it was used point to any specific social or cultural expectations in the interactions between the rich and the poor in South Korea?
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, taxation and inequality. Well, I think that addressing inequality through taxation in developing countries is rather difficult because the state has a limited tax collection capacity, and that ends up relying a lot on the indirect taxes, which are in proportional terms that are actually more unfair to the poorer people. So unless that you have the capacity to collect the income taxes in a serious way, I think that it's going to be quite difficult to address inequality in developing countries. So my view is that probably it's easier in developing countries to rely on restraining the market, as Korea was doing in the old days, than trying to address it through taxation. Yeah, I couldn't quite understand the second question, to caste in Korea. You know, as I tried to imply earlier, that class differences in Korea are only just emerging. So this also addresses the third one partly. So that you know, in Britain, you know, if you are experienced enough, you can kind of place someone in terms of locality and class by just listening to what that person says. You know, oh, he's the South London working class, you know, kind of. But in Korea, that is still not there. You know, in terms of cultural taste, is beginning to separate, but it's not fully developed yet. So yeah, probably it's more like clothes, the smell and things like that distinguish poor people from the rich people, rather than their fundamental behavioral characteristics. So yeah, I mean, in any society, that rich and powerful people try to distinguish themselves by drawing the line somewhere. And yeah, I mean, that in the old days, of course, Korea had very strict the rules about how you should behave in front of your elders and in front of your employer, in front of your lord and everything. But a lot of these had been destroyed. So yeah, I mean, I guess that Park guy in the movie saying things like I have these lines that you shouldn't cross is an attempt of an emerging upper class that are trying to draw the boundaries and set rules for people that they are now beginning to see as their inferior. So it's still kind of society where the class in the cultural sense is being formed rather than having fully been formed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to right away go to our colleague, David Lewis, to pose his question, which I think it also sort of folds in another question by Henry Lowe, and then to Khalil Zambalista, and then to Shanzani Jain. But just before I do, Francisco.
I just will say maybe a word just about the taxation question, and just to say the following. When I started my professional career after my PhD, and we talked about what we should do to reduce inequality in the developing world, we used to never talk about taxation, and we used to talk about how to spend the money. Now, it seems the pendulum has swung completely the other way after Piketty, and we talk only about taxation and not about how to spend the money. And I think both are a mistake. Clearly, yes, developing a system, I mean, Hajun mentioned that there are issues with our ability to tax, but, that ability to tax is endogenous and is a policy choice. And I think we should develop the ability to tax and tax the rich more than we do in most poor countries, and perhaps also in Korea, which is not a poor country. But it's equally important how we then spend that money. And remember, if you spend that money in order to promote the best possible schooling for the poorest children, then the gap between them and those being tutored at home will be smaller, right? So focusing and orienting your public spending towards those who can benefit the most from it and have the weakest ability to fund themselves privately from their families is a very important part. So it's both sides, taxes and spending is what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Very good.
Okay, thanks very much. David.
Yes, thank you, Hajin, for a really fascinating presentation. And I think you've shown really effectively how one can use a movie like Parasite as a kind of gateway or portal into discussing some really important economic issues around inequality. I wanted to try and push you a little bit further about what you think about the status of film as a medium and a source of knowledge about development. And are there things that film can tell us that other sources might not be able to? Other things that film does well and that it reveals about developments that perhaps other sources don't. And so following from that, you know, should we be teaching film alongside World Bank reports and academic papers when we're teaching development? And then finally, and I'm sorry to ask a string of questions, but I was so excited by your presentation that I couldn't help myself. Could you say whether Parasite generated some public debate in South Korea about inequality? I mean, how did people react? And you know, or was it just, you know, a piece of very popular entertainment that people obviously took enormous pride in the fact that it won an Oscar? But did it do more than that?
Great questions, David. Even though he asked three, I'm going to call two more. Cleo Zambalista.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the fascinating lecture. You mentioned at the beginning the declining birth rate in South Korea. And currently many argue that this low fertility rate also derived from large gender inequality in the country. So although this issue wasn't actually mentioned in the movie, I was wondering, how do you see these trends affect future economic growth in South Korea, and what practices the government is taking to tackle them?
Thank you, Cleo. And then Chinzani Jain, who's one of our new MRes students, but I know she's calling in from India, where it's quite late by now.
Hello, thank you for the very good and fascinating lecture, and thank you both Mr. Chang and Francisco. So my question actually came to my mind when you talked about getting or trying to build a new welfare state to sort of, you know, balance out on inequalities and sort of provide for the utterly poor people, not only in Korea perhaps, but around the world. And the question really is, what are the revenue generation mechanisms that the new states, or in this case that you're talking about, South Korea, will have to employ to sort of bring back the financial foundation of that kind of a welfare state? And in relation to this question, you spoke of how collecting direct taxes is a problem, and that's why actually the Indian state has been employing the same argument and narrative to slash virtually all direct taxes. A couple of years ago, I think 5 or 6 years ago, wealth tax was abolished, citing the fact that it was absolutely ineffective and they were not collecting any taxes. In fact, they were incurring more expense towards maintaining the structure to sort of collect those taxes. Inheritance tax has never, as far as I remember, has never been collected in India. And also, I think 1 year ago, corporate taxes were significantly slashed to 15 and 22%.
Okay.
Just a second. The repeated argument that has been employed is that it's difficult to collect taxes, but how else can we achieve the twin objectives of revenue generation at the same time sort of bringing people closer to each other in terms of incomes?
Thank you. Go ahead, Arjun.
Okay, yeah, in response to David's question, yes, I mean, I would like to use movies to teach students if I had the space to do that in the curriculum. I mean, it's that often, you know, there are many movies where there are some very important stories about development or economics in general. So when you are teaching automation, probably that it's best to show them Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times if you want to open up the eyes of privileged the Western students to kind of problems of inequality and poverty, showing the movies like City of God will be very effective. So yes, I mean, by all means, I mean, I think we shouldn't be fixated on the medium of teaching. I mean, some of the movies are much greater than the many books put together in terms of changing people's perspective. Did Parasite generate a lot of debate in Korea? Yes, it did. But you know, the thing about Korea is that there has been continuous debate on inequality. It's a very egalitarian-minded country, and people cannot just accept that inequality keeps rising. I mean, it has in the last few years fallen slightly, but you know, there's a lot of debate all the time. So yes, I mean, made it flare up a bit more, but it's not like the country was kind of, I don't know, like Britain, and before seeing Daniel Blake, people didn't think about food banks, you know. So the clear fertility, yes, the gender inequality is a huge factor in the falling fertility rate. You know, once again, I mean, remember what I said about Koreans, you know, they have to be number one in everything. Eh? So we have the largest gender wage gap in the OECD. It's like, I forget the exact figure, above 30%. You know, the second highest is Japan, which is in the low 20s. And you know, I mean, so that's just one aspect. But there's a lot of gender inequality, not just in terms of pay, but the treatment of married women with children in companies, and you know, the tension with mother-in-laws who expect this very strict Confucian level of the kind of filial loyalty, and you know, so yes, I mean, it's a huge factor in there. It's not just kind of the sense of hopelessness that is driving this fertility rate down. Shinjani, I don't know, you know, as Francisco said, taxation, you have to look at both sides. Yeah? I mean, if low tax itself was good, why don't everyone move to Paraguay? Why don't every company move to Paraguay? Because their top income tax rate is 10%. Their top corporation the income tax rate is 10%. So that if low tax itself is a good thing, everyone that should move there. But people don't, because you may pay low tax, but the kind of service that you get in return in terms of infrastructure, quality of labor force, you know, the legal system and so on is low. So the debate should be shifted. I mean, it's about, if you like, value for money in terms of the taxation that has to be discussed. Now, however, in order to significantly redistribute the income, taxation levels will have to go up in countries like Korea. And this requires actually the political consensus, because it has been a very anti-tax country, because exactly because of the history of maintaining equality and social cohesion through regulatory measures. Tax was very light, and people still cannot, you know, in a way, I mean, it's kind of taking with one hand and giving with another, because if you deregulate, you know, the services you have to buy become cheaper. Yeah? So you can actually pay more taxes. Yeah? But somehow Koreans still haven't accepted this idea of the citizenship-based welfare state. I keep talking about this despite it not being my specialty, that whenever I go to Korea, but even the current government, which is supposed to be progressive, they are loath to raise taxes to expand the welfare state. So, you know, unless there is a kind of the political conversation that leads to a lot of people changing their mind, you know, if people begin to resist the increase in taxation and increase in the welfare state, you know, you cannot, I mean, impose it. So I think that political pact, political alliance that needs to be created.
Oops, thank you, thank you. Now we have two overlapping questions, so I'm gonna allow them both, and then two more, starting with Blair Ng, and then Kate Mahar. Then I'm going to go to Anissa Fitria Sari and Kyunming Park. So Blair.
Hello. Hi, thanks a lot for the very insightful presentation. So I'm just thinking about both Parasite and Squid Game. With their global success, it seems to me that many people around the world can really identify themselves with the inequalities, the violence, and dehumanization in the capitalist system expressed metaphorically in the films. So with this trend, would you expect societies to organize themselves to systematically counter this? And if so, how should this happen in order to be successful? Or do you think it's quite difficult because most of us aren't ready to give up all the benefits and convenience from the big shops and oligarchs, as you mentioned just now? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much. And Kate.
Thanks very much for a great talk. And what I want to ask really is about this gap in income that you're talking about. The inequality makes us think about the gap, but I think Hajun's discussion actually focused our attention more on the ability to get the basics rather than the gap. So I'm wondering if in talking about the effect of inequality in Korea, we should look less at a relative gap in income, which suggests that just people are noticing that other people have more, and focus, as Hajun suggested, on their inability, the inability of the people at the bottom to afford the basics, health, education, housing, access to work, etc., which have been increased by privatization and liberalization. Now, all of these things, many of the things you described are going on in many countries. The rising costs, the high rising unemployment, lack of access. So I'm wondering if you could comment on why it is that the level of social despair seems to be so much more pronounced in Korea, particularly when if you look at the statistics, they don't look so bad. Are they missing out things that are happening behind the scenes? Are they missing out, as you mentioned, social pressures that don't register in the statistics?
Thanks, Kate. Anissa.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. So I'm just trying to reflect what Milanovic wrote in his book, The Global Inequalities. Like, I'm pretty sure he mentioned that Piketty and Kuznets agreed that there are two forces that can lower the inequality: the benign ones like education, taxation, and other regulations by the government, and the maligned one, which are pandemic and war. But then we see how even the malign force like the global pandemic, the COVID-19, proved them wrong since it only exacerbates the inequality. So how effective or how confident are you that the mere regulations by the government, which we can call the benign ones, then be in lowering inequality? Or is there any specific framework to work it out that you have in mind? Thank you.
Thanks. And finally, Kyunmin Park.
Hello. Yes, I'm Kyungmin Park from South Korea, and thank you for the lecture. And I think that the very biggest problem from Korean young people is the sense of helplessness, but lethargic, which is mainly comes from the employment and also the unstable employment problem in Korea. So I just really want to ask you about what is the real reason for this unemployment problem in Korea, and how can we tackle this problem? Thank you.
Hajun.
Thank you. Yeah, no, these are all related questions. So let me try to bring them together. Yeah, first of all, to Kate and Blair, yes, I mean, there is kind of not the simple level of inequality, that's the least of the problem, but the changes in it, and also the kind of things that is implied by the rising inequality. So it's, as Kate put it rightly, it's not really about envy, as Mitt Romney once said, the American politician once said that about people who want greater equality. I mean, it's about that human dignity, access to basic things, and the concern for the fairness. Yeah, I mean, in school, the young people have always been taught that if you work hard, if you play by the rule, if you do well, you know, you will be rewarded. And then they come out and find out that it doesn't happen. Yeah, so that they are angry about it. And yeah, I mean, a lot of these youngsters are in very unstable employment, which was created by all this labor market deregulation. Now, how to change this? I mean, are people going to rise against this? You know, of course, a lot of people are very upset and angry about it, but you know, organizing in a systematic way against the big forces of money and power is always difficult. But you know, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there could be great swelling of the protest around the world, because you know, Francisco mentioned Chile. You know, if someone told me even 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that there'll be mass demonstration against inequality and social problems in Chile and Colombia, I would have laughed it off. Yeah, I mean, I don't call myself a Latin American expert, but I know that quite a few Latin American countries quite well. And you know, yes, I mean, Brazil would have protests. You know, the Mexico would, yeah, Argentina would, but Chile, Colombia, give me a break. You know, these are countries that seem to have kind of made their population buy into this neoliberal system, and have seem to have figured out how to kind of, you know, maintain the system without major disturbances. And boom, you know. So I mean, if you want to know how these changes happen, you have to ask Duncan Green. You know, I'm not an expert on these issues. So you know, I'll leave it to Duncan to deal with those aspects. But I think the one reason why the changes have been so difficult is that now, if you like, the global oligarchical class have developed such an ability to protect themselves. They have been able to, yeah, they've been damaged a bit and discredited a bit. But, you know, in other times, I mean, if you had that two major systemic meltdown like the 2008 global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, a lot of governments would have been kicked out of power. But you know, basically the same people, maybe slightly different parties, and so basically the same people are sitting there running the world. So maybe the ruling class have, after the thousands of years of struggle, finally figured out how to avoid taking responsibility. But you know, I wouldn't be so sure about them having the final laugh, because we don't know how people are going to, you know, organize against all this.
Thanks very much. Francisco, would you like to come in?
No, just very briefly, perhaps just on two questions. One, Blair's question about, you know, do we expect society to organize themselves against, you know, these systems and so on? June already answered that, but let me just say, in addition to all these other difficulties, I think one big problem is the left's inability to have generated an alternative. You know, before it was hard to organize against capitalism, but there was, you know, socialism, Marxism, the idea that we could have a centrally planned economy and share the means of production. And that would. Now the problem is, we know that doesn't work very well. In fact, the successful places that had that have abolished that part of it, like China. So they have market systems, still with authoritarian states on top. But So, there is and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, there was this move at the sort of Clinton Blair years away from almost any, sort of towards a mainstream economic view. So what we need is, and let me say, I'm not saying that it's easy to come up with an alternative, because I actually believe that the market system is an incredibly powerful thing, very efficient, very incentive rich, and so on, which is why somebody mentioned Branko Milanovic, is why he writes the book about capitalism alone, but it is also a huge engine to generate inequalities. So it needs to be combined with a strong state that does a number of things. And we need to sort of provide that alternative about what that number of things is, and be, I think, braver than we have been so far in terms of taxation and regulation and spending. And I think that's going to be the solution. And with that, to very quickly to Anisa's point about benign and malign forces, I'll just say very briefly, there is a region in the world which has seen a decline in inequality. It's a small decline, comparable, relative to how high the inequality is. But Latin America did see a decline in inequality, fairly large decline in absolute terms, in the 2000s. And it was a combination of two things: expanding the welfare state that Ha-Jun was talking about doing in Korea, through certain things, through conditional cash transfers, but also through non-contributory pensions that didn't exist before, and a big expansion in education. I'm not saying that's enough. I'm saying that we should go much further than that, but those two things did contribute. So there are benign forces that can work. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Francisco. We're almost running out of time, but if the people I'm calling on now could be very brief. So first, Sohee Kim, then Laura Mann, our colleague, and then Luis Felipe. Sohee Kim.
Hi, thank you for an amazing lecture. So I want to ask you about the welfare system in Korea. So you mentioned about that. So reversal of the regulations could be a little bit difficult because of the customer efficiency. So we need to do we need to strengthen welfare system more, and there has been a talk about it in Korea as well. And one of the Koreans' leading presidential candidate insists that basic income should be implemented gradually. So I'm curious about your thinking, and also other than that, what would be the first welfare policy that should be restructured in Korea right now?
Okay, that's great. Very pointed. Laura Mann.
Hi, thank you very much, James, and thank you for such an interesting talk. I wanted to ask a little bit more about these market constraining policies and whether at the time these policies were seen as good for growth in terms of sort of putting income in people's hands and supporting the market, or were they kind of acknowledged as being kind of bad for growth but necessary for social reasons? And if there's time to talk about how thinking about that might have changed over time. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for being so succinct. Luis Felipe.
Thank you, Professor Futzel, and thank you, Professor Chan, for your insights. My question is that I had reflected on the symbolic value of this last scene confrontation between the lower class, and I'm thinking now about this as a perfect depiction of the social norms being subordinated to market dynamics and the resulting illusion of meritocracy. And I think that this has huge implications for the political economy of potential solutions, how we think about them. How do we build the images of who's to blame for this inequality, for this economic failure, and in whose hands are these solutions?
Okay, big questions, very little time, but I do want to give both Ha-Jun and Francisco a chance to come back.
Yeah, I'll try. The basic income. Yeah, I think there are different kinds of basic income. But if you go for the Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, Silicon Valley Thai conversion, I'm totally against it. But even for more benign versions, I think what needs to be discussed is how you are going to provide the welfare, yeah? Healthcare, and all these things. Because you can give people the money, but if the provision is left to the private sector, that will become hugely costly. Yeah? So I'm more inclined towards ideas like basic services. Yeah? Access to basic services is more important than basic income. Yeah? I can go on about it, but I'll leave it there. Laura's question, yes, I mean these the restraints on markets were considered bad for growth, but being good for social cohesion. Now that you want to change that something has to give, yeah, and that is what I think is missing, because people want to have their cake and eat it, yeah. They want the deregulated the retail and services market. Yeah? They want them to be as cheap as possible, and then they don't want to pay high taxes. Yeah? But they still want that social cohesion and the equality of opportunity. Yeah? I mean, not all of them can be achieved. Yeah? I mean, if you want the quick delivery services at low prices, it means that there are poor people working like hell to deliver 70 parcels in 6 hours, yeah? At very low rate of pay. Yeah? You cannot have social cohesion and deregulated market without having a welfare state. Yeah? So they have to realize that they have to give up something, but unfortunately, it's still not clicking together in most people's mind in Korea. Well, finally, the contrast between social norms and market forces. Yeah, I think that there's no ideal mixture that works for everyone, for everything. I mean, the market forces, the social norms, and the more organized institutions, they all have roles to play. So exactly what combination you go for is really up to you. And yeah, it's not exactly relevant example, but one of my favorite mottos is that life is stranger than fiction. And in that context, I always mention Singapore, which has had a free trade policy and has welcomed foreign investors, but 90% of its land is owned by the government. 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation, and staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises. Yeah? So, you can have these extremely unusual combinations, and who's to say that there's one right solution? But yeah, I mean, all these things need to be kind of put together in a way that they complement each other rather than work against each other. Thank you.
Great. Francisco.
Well, I guess we're out of time, but I'll say two things very, very quickly. One, just nerdy one, is that Hajun mentioned earlier that his data came from the OECD, and that may very well be what was the difference between our, and it's not that one is better than the other or worse than the other, is that the World Bank's data is based on per capita income, and the OECD's data is based on equivalized income using an equivalent scale. So for whoever's interested in that, that's probably what that was. And then to end on a slightly less nerdy note, just to say one thing about Parasite, right, is it shows the importance of the family as a machine to reproduce inequality. And we all do it. We all read to our kids. We all try to send them to the best schools, give them the best opportunities. So the reason you need a welfare state proactively involved in providing opportunities for those who don't have it from the family. And that takes a lot of resources. And so I'm very much in support of this welfare state that Arjun is talking about, but it's got to be more proactive than it is at the moment in terms of directing opportunities to those who don't have it. Thank you.
We are going to continue this debate next week, where we're going to be joined by Gabrielle Palma with a talk, Why the Rich stay rich no matter what. And discussing his talk is going to be Branko Milanovic, who came up tonight in our discussion. Well-known senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York. So with that, I really want to, on behalf of all the audience, far away and close in the LSE, thank Ha-Joon Chang once again for brilliant talk. And Francisco, we need to have you come back and give your own talk here. Thanks very much for joining us. And Ha-Joon and Francisco, don't go away.
Yeah.